This is Creepy and Geeky, a part of the Morbidly Beautiful Podcast Network. Welcome to Creepy and Geeky. I'm your host, Robert, and on today's episode, we're talking about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Joining me for this intergalactic journey is Ashley Thomas, a writer and podcaster who is the co-host of Podcast 616, a Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast. Welcome back to the show, Ashley.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me back, brother. It's good to be back on Creepy and Geeky.
Yeah, and in your neck of the woods here with the, being in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Right. So, I mean,
yeah.
To be fair, the creepy side of the Creepy and Geeky is also my neck of the woods too. But
True.
I don't host my own podcast on that one.
Yeah. And for anybody who might not already know, but I've mentioned it several times, I have guested on Podcast 616 at least 4 times now. So
has it been that many?
Awesome. Yeah, I did Werewolf by Night,
right?
The Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special,
mm-hmm.
Guardians of the Galaxy. Oh no, not Guardians. Ant-Man Quantumania,
right?
And one of the episodes for Secret Invasion.
Oh, that's right, man! I didn't realize it had been that many times. I'm
I'm
very glad it's that
regular.
many times. Hey, dude, no, I ain't mad about it. And you're going to be a guest on Loki here in just a little bit.
Yeah, that's gonna be exciting. So. All right. Anytime I get a chance to come on your show is always a fun time. You and Hugh have a lot of fun on there, and it's always good to stretch out my Marvel stuff, which is I get to do on my show now too. So that's always fun.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, so today we are talking about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, which is obviously the awesome sequel to the first one.
Mm-hmm.
This is in phase 3 now, so it's the third movie of phase 3, so it's just kind of in the beginning. Sets them up in a not in a new status quo, but in the beginning it's the familiar cast that came together in the first movie. But by the end of it, we got a couple of new additions. And we'll get there.
Right.
But yeah, I really enjoyed this movie. I'm not sure if I like it more than the first one or if I'm just kind of even on it. But it's a lot of fun. There's a lot I do like about it. And we're going to get into a lot of that. But how do you feel about this movie?
So Guardians 1 and 2 are just about the same for me.
Okay.
I like them both a lot for different reasons.
Right.
I feel like Guardians 2 is this interesting treatise on fatherhood and family.
Right.
I think it's also because I love music. I love the music of this era that all the Guardians movies tend to lean into, of the 70s and 80s, that
right.
Guardians 2 feels a little more thematic musically for me, which is something that I think is really fascinating. And it's something that you miss if you don't know a lot of music history, right, per se. And I mean, we can dig into it a little more later, but I have a lot to say about the usage of The Chain and Brandy and other songs within this within the musical soundtrack choices, but right, how well they work thematically with this film. And while it's not perfect, there's some issues, I think, in particular with the ego showdown, but overall, I think it's just as good as Guardians 1. It's just different. And so if that if the difference in Guardians 1 and Guardians 2 doesn't jive with you, you're not going to think
Right.
Guardians 2 is as good. But in my opinion, I think both films are on equal standing. I love them both.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. Yeah, I think that it's a fairly good summation of that in that way. I think that for me with the music, I think the music is really good, but for me, it's not as iconic as the first
Right.
one in terms of the music. But I think that's because the music in the first one is more broad-based appeal type, whereas, like you said, this one's probably more thematically connected to the overall story.
Yeah.
And like we said, like you said with Brandy, that plays a part in it. It's very specific part in that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting to see the differences in that. Like each one of these has gotten, even in number three, the soundtrack in that one's even more kind of, for me, even looser than this one was in terms of like, recognizability. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and um, but I like that, especially, when we'll talk about that, is that from your point of view, the music is more integral in a lot of ways than it was
Right.
in the first one. Whereas first one was the first one, I think, was more about feeling, about
Mm-hmm.
definitely soundtracking the scenes and giving you a sense of what those scenes were like and everything, like really enhancing them. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's what James Gunn is one of those directors, along with Quentin Tarantino, Edgar Wright, who really know how to mix music into their movies well, and make them an integral part of it, more of a storytelling tool than some other directors do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely agree.
But but that being said, I want to start at the beginning and talk about our first introduction to this version of Little Groot, and him dancing to Mr. Blue Sky while they're
Yeah.
all fighting in the background. It's a great scene because it's this huge battle going on, and yet we're not seeing it clearly. We're seeing just kind of in fuzzy background where we're watching Groot just scamping around, having fun. It's a great introduction to the movie and to little Groot himself.
Absolutely. And do I understand correctly that James Gunn opted to do the motion capture for Baby Groot in that scene?
I
It's
don't
him
know. That's
dancing.
funny.
I want to
That
say
would be funny.
I read that somewhere somewhat recently, but I haven't fact checked that myself. So if I'm wrong, I'm so sorry. I normally fact check these things, but it didn't occur to me until until just now that we're talking about it. But it's funny because at the end of the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, I look over at my husband, who I affectionately refer to as Mr. Nerdy Blogger. Mr. Nerdy Blogger. At the end of the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, and we see the first time we see Baby Groot in the flower pot dancing. I
Right.
look at him and I laugh, and I was like, he's like, "What? What's so funny?" It's like, "You dance exactly like Baby Groot," and he's like, "What? What are you talking about?" And then we saw Guardians of the Galaxy 2. We went with a couple of our friends who also love Marvel and Marvel movies, and we were pretty new friends at the time. We'd only been friends for a few months, and I said, "Guys, I didn't want to say anything, but Mr. Nerdy Blogger was asked to do all the motion capture for Baby Groot in the dance scene." And they'd known him long enough to have seen his dance moves, and they were like, "Oh, I believe that."
That's very
So
funny.
anyway, to be abundantly clear, Mr. Nerdy Blogger did not do the dance moves. Those may or may not have been James Gunn. It may have just been Sean Gunn because he does all the other motion capture
Yeah.
stuff. But even so, I love that scene. Not just
Yeah.
because it's fun and it's adorable to watch Baby Groot dance, but it's as much in the DNA of the Guardians to be looking out for Groot to say, hey, you need to get out of here. This is not a
Right.
place for a baby. Why are you dancing right now?
Well, and Rocket even stops at one point to come and like get him to spit out the bug that he's trying to eat too. Like, it's just it's so much. It Little Groot in this is very much a toddler. I have a 2-year-old grandson,
Oh
and
yeah.
who lives with us. All my kids live with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's so funny to see something like that, because that's definitely taken from an experience of having a little kid around, and just
Mm-hmm.
having to be like, no, 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 get that out of your mouth. You don't need to be putting that in your mouth. So it's just so funny, just that whole sequence, and just everything. There's so much with Little Groot that I think is um especially because it's one thing, like when this originally came out, my grandson wasn't born yet.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I had vague memories of my own kids being like that, of course. But seeing it all again with him, and then watching the movie, is just like it just makes it even funnier. So,
Right,
but
right, for sure.
yeah, but it's a fun scene. Otherwise, like I said, most of the battles in the background, you're not seeing most of what's going on, except for in very fuzzy detail. But that's what makes it really fun. I mean, it's very very much in keeping with the tone of James Gunn in general, and just having kind of fun, focusing on things that maybe aren't as important, and you gotta love that.
Right, right. It really, even though it's kind of a silly scene, it really does add a lot of characterization for how this group is interacting and working
Right.
together and things like that. So I really enjoy it on that level.
Well, and what's fun about it too is that it really shows and sets up that for the most part, they are very good. They are very good at working together.
Hmm.
At the very least, Peter, Gamora, and Rocket are. Drax, of course, is just being Drax. So
I mean, not to get into Guardians 3, but he's still very dad-like in
yeah,
all of this as well. So,
right. Yeah, no, you're definitely seeing a lot of it's here and there, but you get a little bit more into his past. You get little hints to his past, but in um and just that you know being that dad, that, like you said, comes into play more in the third movie. So it's interesting to see, just when you watch these movies, and then having seen number three and going back to this one, makes it more interesting, because you do see how much James Gunn has connected it all,
right.
and has made this one giant story, not just pieces of a story. So
Hmm.
it's nice to
Right.
see that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So, but yeah, I mean that also leads into another thing that a through line that goes throughout this whole movie is Rocket,
Mhm.
and Rocket being a major douche the
Right.
entire time. And it starts right here in the beginning. He's doing his thing, and like I said, they're working together well, but he he ends up stealing the batteries, even though this puts them into
Right.
a the batteries that they were sent there to protect, that they were hired by uh um they're hired by the Sovereign, this interesting race that we learn more about in the third movie. um but hired by the Sovereign to help protect those batteries, and then Rocket ends up just stealing some anyway,
Right.
which then puts them in a bad position. And it's a pattern of behavior through the whole movie, of Rocket just doing things that are intended to piss off the rest of the group.
Hmm.
There's no other reason for it other than to piss them off and push them away. And
Right.
it comes, at the end, it comes together. But it's um but I think it's an interesting concept, and it's something, again, that you learn about in the third movie more about why he does this. But at least in the context of this movie, it's, it's about what he's doing is something that lots of people will do. And that's, push away people, um that even though they're your friends or your family or whatever, you're pushing them away before you can be hurt by them.
Right.
And I thought that was an interesting through line through all this with Rocket's storyline.
Yeah, I think it was not something I picked up on in the first couple of watches,
Right.
but watching before Guardians 3 came out, I really picked up on that. Like, oh, he's really being a jerk, not just because Rocket like can be a jerk sometimes, but
Right.
because he's afraid of getting too close to anybody. And
Right.
that's I mean, a lot of people have a fear of emotional intimacy, and that's definitely something that we see in his character. He's afraid, and we find out why in Guardians 3.
Right.
He's afraid of forming these longer lasting, real relationships versus surface level relationships or business type relationships. Excuse me. And so all of that really plays into how he acts and interacts with other people in this film.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it's interesting, like, because like you said, like, normally he's a pretty abrasive person in general. But he's usually not trying to intentionally push people away that care about him.
Mm-hmm.
Um and it's and he learns by the end that he doesn't need to do that, and that it's that the people who are around him, the guardians themselves, they care about him, and they want to be with him and be a family with him, be this newfound family.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you look at all of these characters, and I talked about it in the previous Guardians episode, is that each one of these members of this group come from damaged families. They all have families who've died. They've or have they've um been separated from, and so it's interesting that they've made this weird little family that they are, and they're gonna have issues, and they even say that, I think it's Peter in this one says, yeah, you might argue with your family and everything, but you're still gonna they're still gonna love you, they're still gonna accept you, and it's you just got to get past that stuff. And so I just think it's a interesting, like, they're in this one, their family gets bigger,
Right.
and and that's, whereas the whole series is about family and about found family, I think this one is where the family really coalesces, because in the first one they just come together and they're like, okay, well, we'll hang together for a bit, but this one's where they really become that family.
Yeah, definitely agree with that assessment. There's a lot of family dynamics in this film, be
Mm-hmm.
it
Yeah.
the father son dynamic with Quill and Ego, but also you get a little more insight into Quill and his mother's relationship.
Right.
You have the adoptive father relationship with Quill and Yondu, and then of course you have the Guardians becoming this sort of, hey, none of us share DNA, but we're going to choose to be and act like a family because
Right.
that's going to be our dynamic.
Well, and we also have Gamora and Nebula
Oh,
in
yeah,
this
yeah.
one,
I
that
definitely would be remiss if I didn't talk about
yeah.
that because I have a lot of big feels about that.
Yeah, and we can get into that one right now, because I think that it's interesting because they start out in the beginning of this, they start off very antagonistic. Gamora's trying to take Nebula back to Xandar to you know um pay for her crimes, Um, and during the course of all of this, they learn to put their past behind their hatred, not necessarily hatred, but their animosity. Nebula hates Gamora, but Gamora didn't really hate Nebula.
Right.
And so it's, they find a middle ground that they can start working on together in during the course of this, and they find um some peace through their shared pain. And I thought that was really good about trying to put that past not necessarily behind you, but trying to understand where each other are coming from, and um and trying to find that middle ground where that you can start coming together and working towards a future together.
For sure. And I think, again, I am but an armchair psychologist.
Yes,
I
same.
do not have any degrees in psychology or counseling or therapy or anything like that.
Yeah, same here.
But from what bit I do know of children of narcissists and people who have friends of mine, unfortunately, who have grown up with narcissistic parents, uh that's very much the kind of relationship that Gamora and Nebula have.
Oh yeah.
One of them was um the golden child, and the other was the whipping boy, basically.
Yeah.
And Gamora was that. She was the perfect kid, couldn't do any wrong, and then unfortunately Nebula was the recipient of all of um Thanos's anger and hatred and negative feeling and all of that. So
Right.
it's tough. It's tough because on one hand that um they were both just trying to survive, and they were both trying to figure out how to get by and how to cope without dealing with the negative emotions or negative reaction to Thanos. And that's it's a heartbreaking scenario. And
Right.
unfortunately it's a scenario that is all too common in not Marvel movies, in real life, in superhero, in not in superhero films. It's something that, I mean, sadly, this type of parent child dynamic occurs every single day. And
Right.
so I feel pity for both of them because they were both just doing what they needed to do to survive. And I don't blame Nebula for feeling how she does about Gamora, because unfortunately Nebula received all of the I mean, let's call it what it is, physical abuse from
Right. Yeah.
Thanos. I mean, much greater than any physical abuse normal people receive. I don't let me rephrase, because I feel like that diminishes physical abuse that people have received, and I certainly don't want to do that. But in real life, people don't often have all of their skeleton and joints and
Yeah.
musculature replaced by robotics. So I mean, I guess it's the sci-fi equivalent of that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and so again, I apologize if that came across as callous, and it's certainly not my intent. Um, but it's basically like a heightened version of
Right.
that experience in a sci-fi setting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, yeah, I totally understand that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, and I agree. I think that, it's she was the recipient of all of the abuse and, body modification,
Mm-hmm.
that, because every time she lost to Gamora, she would have to be like, Thanos just figured, well, let me rebuild her and, try to make her better so that maybe she'll be able to fight her this time, beat her
Right.
this time.
Right.
And and that's horrible. I mean, like,
Mm-hmm.
and like Gamora says in this, she was just doing what she could to survive. She had no animosity towards Nebula at all. Just
Right.
that she needed to survive herself, and to survive she had to beat Nebula. And she, you know it's a bad situation no matter what you're in.
For
um
sure.
and I think that if they can find the place to get past it, which they do to an extent, that at least with Nebula finds a way to um learn to live with it,
Mm.
and move on to a certain degree, especially after Thanos is gone. So I think that takes a burden off of her, that while he's alive, is there, because no matter where she is, she would always have that specter of him looming over her.
For sure.
Um,
For sure.
and once he's gone, then at least she can move on and become something different, and become somebody different, who she wants to be.
Yeah, yeah, definitely agree with that. I think the biggest gut punch of a line in this film is where Nebula and Gamora are fighting each other towards the end of the film, and Nebula yells at her, "All I ever wanted was a sister."
Right.
And so you are better versed in the comics lore of the Guardians than I am. Are was Nebula a natural born daughter of Thanos, or was she also adopted? Which one is the older? Are they about the same age? What's the situation there?
So the situation is much, much different in the comic books.
Okay.
Nebula herself is, we're not exactly sure of her relationship to Thanos. There's a time Thanos has a history of resurrection.
Mm.
He dies and comes back. But during a long stretch of time after he had been killed, she found his ship and claimed to be the granddaughter of Thanos.
Mm-hmm.
And so she, and once he comes back alive, he says that he, has no children, has no granddaughter. So her parentage is kind of in question. So, and I don't, and this is solely on what I have read from the 80s. I'm not sure if they have since retconned any of that into her being closer, because I know they've retconned her into looking more like she does in the movies now.
Mm-hmm.
But she was not at the time when I was reading her back, before and during the original Infinity Gauntlet storyline. She had no confirmed relationship to Thanos. But
Okay,
Gamora
gotcha.
herself had been an adopted daughter of Thanos.
Gotcha.
So
I didn't know which one was adopted first then, or came into the Thanos family
right.
before. So I was just curious if there was like an
No,
older
no,
sister,
that's a good question.
younger sister dynamic there. Um,
Uh,
I mean, I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be an older sister, younger sister dynamic, because
right.
I mean, I've definitely had, I have a younger sister, and we definitely get along well now, that we're both adults.
Right.
But when we were kids growing up, we we would definitely, butt heads all the time. And it definitely went both ways. We were both
Yeah.
antagonists in that relationship for sure. uh but there was definitely a point where I felt like, you know what, this is stupid. I want to have a good relationship with my sister, and
Yeah.
because of some of my own antagonism, I had to work really hard to get that. um And so I could see it as a dynamic that really could have went either way.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think most siblings, have that those kind of,
Mm-hmm.
somewhat antagonistic relationships. I know I did with my sister growing
Mm-hmm.
up. And it's always harder, if you are the younger sibling in a lot of ways because the older one is, usually um the one who you have to live up to in a lot of ways. And so
Mm-hmm.
that can cause friction that may not be caused by the siblings themselves, but is just kind of just the way you feel as a younger child or whatever. I was the older child, so I'm not exactly sure, and I haven't talked to my sister in years. I think that at least with this one, that and again, they are adopted sisters, so there's no real blood family there and everything, and it just continues to play into the found family nature of this franchise, which I think is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure, for sure.
But I do think it's a fun thing because the Guardians themselves, this version of the Guardians, and I kind of go into this. I think I went into this a little bit with the in the first episode. The Guardians themselves, based on the comic book stuff, this version of the Guardians is the more, I guess, recent version of the Guardians. But Drax and Gamora are part of a group that fought Thanos earlier, and that included Adam Warlock, who we meet in the third movie, and Pip the Troll, who is was a very small cameo at the end of the Eternals. So so it's
Mm-hmm.
a little bit of a different group um, that Gamora and Drax were part of back in the 70s and 80s,
Mm-hmm.
and early 90s. Um, so it's in the wake of all the Infinity Gauntlets storyline and stuff like that.
Right.
So the comic book stories are always so interesting and weird when they kind of mash these together, because they did create a Guardians of the Galaxy comic book that had Star Lord, Rocket, Drax, and Gamora. All these, Mantis becomes a member later. Adam Warlock becomes a member. They It's an interesting grouping of people. But the original Guardians of the Galaxy um, comic book and the characters were actually set in the 30th century.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So yeah, yeah. So the original Guardians were a future group, which included the characters. Some of the characters we meet in this in this movie, in this second movie, the character played by Sylvester Stallone, Stakar. He's one of the members of that group, called Starhawk, I believe. Um,
Yeah, something like that. I've read a
yeah,
little bit of the original run.
yeah,
My public library over here has a good portion of. I mean, one, they just have an incredible like graphic novel selection.
right,
Period. Full stop. So uh, they they had when the after the first Guardians movie came out, I was like, I don't. This is like the first time I've ever watched a Marvel movie where I didn't know anything about any of the characters that were in this Marvel movie.
right,
So let me correct this. And so I had such a good time like reading that a little bit of that first graphic novel, and like again, like this is the first time I've been I had was experiencing a Marvel thing where, oh, I didn't know anything about these people at first. So
right,
yeah, so yeah, that's I had wondered because it's been a minute since I've read those, and I didn't get to read the whole like volume. Um,
right.
I had wondered if Stallone's character was that same guy. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. He's playing a version of Starhawk,
Mhm.
who is more of a prominent member in the late 80s, early 90s version of the comic book, um, that was done by Jim Valentino,
Mhm.
which is the one that I'm most familiar with during that time period. but yeah, him, Martin X, which is the crystal guy,
Hmm.
um, Charlie 27, which is the big guy that Ving Rhames plays,
Hmm.
Alita, who was played by Michelle Yao in this one,
Hmm.
or Yo,
Yo,
Michelle
yeah,
Yo,
Michelle Yeoh, yeah. Hmm.
and Yandu himself was a member of this 30th century group. So it's interesting that like they brought them in and made them part of this more current timed uh, version of the Guardians. Um, and so it's and it was fun to see them kind of put variations of these characters in this movie. Um,
Right,
and so it was a neat little Easter egg for people who are fans of the comic books.
right.
Um, and so it's a um, I'm kind of glad they didn't really go with that version, just because I don't know, it feels like not sillier, but just it feels so much different than the current um I guess sensibilities. So it's
Yeah,
nice to
it's
see them in these versions, but not in their own, like not in their own movie.
for sure. Yeah, it's definitely a different vibe uh, from this iteration of the Guardians versus the OG comic iteration.
Right. Yeah. So it's fun to see them. But it's going back to, let's see, check my notes here. But talking about Yandu, it's interesting when we first see him, he's on Contraxia. They're him and the Ravagers are, you know, just hanging out in what is like, can only be described as like a brothel.
Right.
It's very kind of like Western style. They're just hanging out like at a bar slash brothel and everything. And it, which is funny because so many people talk about how the Marvel's cinematic universe is sexless, that there's no real romance or sex going on in these movies. And to be fair, there's not a lot going on. They keep
Right.
these movies fairly tame, um, for general audiences because they want the widest possible audience for these movies, which makes a lot of sense. When you're putting a lot of money into these things, you want to make a lot of money.
Hmm.
So, but I did find it interesting that in this movie we do have this aspect of this that's pretty blatant. It's not very hidden at all. And so I thought that was an interesting aspect for this movie specifically.
Right, right, for sure.
Um, but it's it's so it's interesting when they do put stuff like that in there. It's because it's not common,
Hmm.
which is it's an if you're okay with that kind of stuff, it's good, and I understand if you're not okay with it, but it's I don't know. I don't know where I was going with it, but I just thought it was an interesting thing to mention, being that most of the Marvel universe is pretty sexless.
Right, right, right. And I think if nothing else, it's um, what's the right terminology? It is narratively necessary for this story.
Narratively consistent,
Right.
I would
There you go.
think. Yeah.
There you go. Hmm.
Yeah, because of who the Ravagers are, it makes sense. They're pirates and criminals and stuff like that. So that you would think, of course, this is the kind of place that they would hang out in between whatever they're doing.
Well, and even to take it a step further, not even necessarily just talking about the Ravagers, but you you find out by the end of the film that Ego has sowed his wild oats all about
Mm,
the galaxy.
yeah,
And so Peter's got all of these half siblings that Ego has killed because none of them can handle like the power that he wants to give them,
right,
with the and so the only family that he finds out later that he has is Mantis.
right,
So that's that's really, I mean, that's a hard thing.
yeah,
um
No,
because
yeah,
Peter's mom talked about how wonderful Ego was, and how his daddy was an angel, and
yeah,
he was from space and all of this other stuff, and everybody thought she was bananas.
yeah,
So, you know, it's it's a hard thing to reckon with when you've been told this one story of how your parents had this fairy tale relationship, but now one of your parents is gone, and as far as you know, the other one is gone too for
right.
whatever reason, which is why Peter Quill told everybody that his daddy was Knight Rider.
David Hasselhoff. Yeah.
So,
No, yeah,
yeah.
and I want to definitely get into all of this about Ego because this is interesting, and about Peter really because
Sure.
Peter is this guy who his only notion of like masculinity or and father figures really is this notion of having David Hasselhoff as his pretend father, and then being taken from Earth, and then having this terrible father figure in Yandu,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then finally discovering that his real dad is still alive and is out there and is this like crazy powerful planet dude, and it's got to throw your whole world into like chaos, um, and
Right.
all that longing for a good father figure, especially after Yandu. As much as Yandu, kind of, they kind of make, they kind of come back around on it by the end of the movie, but Yandu didn't treat him well, and that's all Peter wanted was somebody to be his mom or dad and to feel that love, and he thinks he gets that with Ego. um
Right.
and it's heartbreaking, um when he finds out that that's just not what he was looking for.
For sure. And as an aside, I've watched Big Trouble in Little China in the past week, and and I'm John Carpenter's my favorite director, full stop. And so I've seen Big Trouble in Little China several times, but I
Yeah,
really noticed this week is like, dang, he really does. Like Chris Pratt really could be Kurt Russell's son in another
that's
universe.
funny.
He absolutely could. Oh man. But anyway, yeah, I watched that. It's like, yeah, I could believe he's Jack Burton's son.
Yeah, yeah. No, and Kurt Russell's so good. Like he's such a good
Oh yeah.
actor.
Oh, he's wonderful.
That
I
like
love him.
yeah. I mean, not even just John Carpenter stuff, but the stuff that he's done with Quentin Tarantino.
Hmm.
And just everything he's done over the years. And being a child actor who got
Right.
even more successful. He was popular as a child actor with the Disney movies that he did.
Yeah,
And
I know
then
he was wasn't he was I don't remember who he's the voice of on The Fox and the Hound, but
oh, I don't
um
remember.
I was really surprised learning as an adult, like, oh, this movie that made me cry at age 8 was Kurt Russell.
Yeah.
Like, what?
Ah, sorry.
Yeah, no, it all good. I think wasn't he also in like Escape to Witch Mountain?
I don't think so. He was
I may have made that
in
up.
he w he was in like the computer wore tennis shoes, um uh and a couple of other ones, The Strongest Man in the World. I remember that one
Mm,
as a kid. Um but he transitioned by 1980. He was already transitioning into the adult actor that he became.
sure. Right. But yeah,
Um
yeah, Kurt Russell is just a gem in
yeah, oh
everything.
yeah.
So
And just his work with
happy. Go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
No, you go ahead.
I'm happy to watch him in anything. I've never watched the Santa Claus movies that he's done in
Oh
recent
yeah, I haven't
memory.
seen him yet either.
I have a friend who's a big movie buff, and he's like, not gonna lie, Kurt Russell is my favorite Santa Claus in anything, period. So I'm like, all right, all right. Kurt Russell was the voice of Copper in Fox and the Hound. He was
Oh,
Hound
okay.
Dog, which was the line that made all of us laugh a whole lot when I was a kid. And I'm shocked to learn that that was in 1981 because that's also the same year that he was Snake Plissken in Escape to New York.
Yeah,
So he must have been adult Copper, not child Copper. Oh man,
probably. Yeah.
yeah. Now I'm gonna have to look. Oh man, that's gonna bug me. Dang. Oh, yeah, Corey Feldman was young Copper. Okay.
Oh, there you
Oh,
go.
so he was adult Copper. Okay, so I'm not losing my marbles. All right. Jeez Louise. Okay, anyway, sorry. I digress a whole bunch. Um,
But no, I think it's interesting that this bit with him with Kurt Russell playing his playing Ego. So in the comic books, um uh the Ego is a living planet. Very
right.
similar to what we see in this. Although I don't believe there's ever been in the comic books, and I could be wrong, but what little I know about it is that he's just a planet. He's never had a an ability to make a version of himself that can go off into other places.
Mm-hmm.
He's just a planet with a face. Um, so,
Gotcha.
and we see that at one point in the movie where it like turns and you see the face of the planet, but that's literally how he looks all the time
Mm-hmm.
in the comic books. He's just a planet with a face.
Mm-hmm.
So it's it's an interesting character for sure. But they expand on his stuff in this because they say he's a celestial being, but he's not related to the celestials that we see in the Eternals.
Right.
So at least in terms of the comic books, movie universe could be different.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's I really enjoy having him be the villain, and this is another time where, and I've talked about this multiple times in these episodes about the heroes having to fight a dark mirror sometimes, but this is not one of those cases, and this is why I love this too. Is that this is a character that is extremely powerful. There's almost no way of stopping him,
Right.
except for through the teamwork of the Guardians altogether. And it's I like that aspect of it. It's like him and Hela, they're just so overpowered that you can't do anything to stop them except for just destroy them completely.
Right.
And I like that kind of character too. That this kind of villain is just evil for evil's sake. Doesn't have a. I do like the characters that are like Killmonger and like Namor, where they have us. They're sympathetic. You can understand why they're doing what they're doing, even if you don't agree with it. Um, but I really like this kind of villain as well, similar to like Kang and the High Evolutionary, where they're just evil. Um, so I really enjoy that kind of bad guy.
Yeah. I was I remember about the time um this movie came out, IndieWire put out an article and I'll send you a link for this if you want to include it in show notes, but
Okay.
Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 pulls off the impossible, solving Marvel's villain problem. Um so James Gunn has made the first MCU movie that isn't good in spite of its antagonist, but because of it. And I think that's one of the things to me, at least, and it's been a minute since I've read the article, so I don't remember the conclusion they came to. So if you want to include that in show notes, people can make their own decisions. But
Yeah.
one of the things that I liked about Guardians 2 is that, I mean, let's be honest, sometimes you face people in your life that are like Ego, and they literally don't care about anyone but themselves, even their own
Right.
children, people in their family. They literally care absolutely nothing about anybody else except for themselves. And I think, I mean, this came out in what, 2016?
I think 2014. Let's see.
Or is it later than that or early? No, 2017. So
Okay,
this
yeah,
came out in
2017.
2017. So this is a post Trump era villain.
Yeah,
And I mean, again, not a psychologist. This is not a politics podcast,
right,
but you would be hard pressed to deny that Donald Trump is anything except a narcissist.
right.
And this is exactly what ego is he is a
Yeah.
complete and utter narcissist. I think the
I mean, he
only
lives up to his name. He's
yeah,
ego.
he's literally an ego.
Yeah,
Period. Full stop. And I I think like the only better or at minimum on equal footing, but I think better and a little more nuanced representation of a narcissistic villain in fiction, media, literature is Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones.
yeah,
Slash A Song of Ice and Fire. I think like she is the absolute height of narcissism.
yeah.
And I think ego is like the sci-fi comedy version of narcissism versus Cersei being like the fantasy drama version of
Right,
narcissism. I think between both of these characters, I think you have a really good picture of what does it mean to be a narcissist. And
right,
I mean, a lot of that boils down to not caring about anyone but yourself and your own interests, means whatever you think is going to give you the most power, etc.
right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's his whole deal in this too, is just he just wants to spread himself around the world, around the universe. He doesn't care that he's killing people. He doesn't care
Mm-hmm.
that the children that he created with other um people um throughout all this, these other half siblings of Peter that have died along the way because they just don't have the power, the spark inside of them that he wants, so that he can, push that power, push himself to the limits of creation, to take over everything. And it's just, because I mean, presumably the reason he's doing that is because, he says in this thing that he has to come back to himself, his little version of himself. He has to come back to it, quite often, to kind of replenish himself. Um, he can't be separate from himself for too long. And presumably by spreading himself out, literally spreading his seeds across the universe, that, once his those plants have taken over those planets, then he's got stepping stones all around the universe that he can just, he never has to worry about having to go back to that original self. He could just, be on those planets and exist in those areas. Um,
Yeah.
but it's also interesting though too, because he originally says that, he was alone in the universe, and he part of the whole reasoning behind this was to not be alone anymore. But by taking over these planets and basically terraforming them into himself, he's still alone. It's like it's such a dumb thing to do, like, and it just goes into that narcissism that you feel like you're so much more important, and that your reasonings behind this, he doesn't really not want to be alone. He just wants to be the only one there.
Right.
In the grand scheme of things, he's such a big narcissist that he believes he's the only one who can exist in the universe, and everybody else is just not worth being around.
Well, and he even says to Peter, I would have I very nearly stayed with your mother, but I,
That's
I
true.
had I had to leave, so I gave her a brain tumor.
Yeah.
Like so like it wasn't enough for him to just leave and let her
To
be Like
Well,
the fact that she existed would have interfered with his plans, and therefore he gave her a brain tumor to kill her.
right. Well,
Like,
and
it's
that's interesting
horrible.
too, because there's a point because he says that too, that it, Peter's mom almost made him stay. Like the love he felt for her almost made him forget his, you know, narcissistic goal
Right.
of reforming the universe. And so that's just it's very interesting to hear that aspect of it, because you know that he denied that potential for love and happiness to accomplish this weird goal of his, and to do that and to not be tempted into that again. That's why he gave her that brain tumor. And it's
Mhm.
just like, what a shitty fucking version of this there
Right.
is. It's just,
Right.
it's just it I don't know, it just smacks of that, like we said, the narcissism and the abusiveness and everything. And that's the thing too, is that when Peter decides, hey, I'm not doing this because you killed my mom. um when he hears that, he's like, no, 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 I'm not gonna help you with this. Ego's just like, nope, you are, and forces him to do it rather than giving him any kind of choice in the matter,
Right.
because it's his end goal in all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So we get to the kind of end fight with this, and that's what helps Peter come, like, again, he gets taken over at one point, and he ends up finding the power within him with Yondu's help, um, and you know, uh, in being able to stop Ego, um,
Right.
and using Ego's own power against him, which was, I thought, poetic, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. I also love that he decided, how can I fight ego? I'm going to be Pac-Man.
Yeah, yeah,
And like, I know you're a little bit older than me, Rob, but I think our souls are approximately the same age. So the fact that like everything that Peter references is a thing that I love. So stuff like
yeah,
Pac-Man and everything from the 80s. I'm like, yes,
yeah.
please.
I think it's funny too, because I had to look it up after watching the first one, and going into doing the episode for the first one, because I was like, what year was it he was taken from? Because I was like, he's got so much knowledge of the 80s.
88.
Yeah, he was taken in 88. And so I was just like, okay, all right, that at least makes sense that
Mhm.
the bulk of the 80s at that point, bulk of the pop culture knowledge that he would know about, and that he references so much, I could understand then that he would be, because I mean, the 80s were so rife with that pop culture aspect of it. And we were the TV generation,
Right.
that we just absorbed all of that. And so, as a child of the 80s, I I definitely can understand where he's coming from
For sure.
with all those references.
And I mean, to be totally fair, like I was born in 85, and
Okay.
because I grew up in a small town in East Tennessee in a pre-internet era. Before the
Yeah.
internet hit in the mid late 90s, I feel like it took like an extra five years or so for culture to hit my area from where I
Yeah.
grew up. And so I feel like culturally speaking, I very much had a late 70s, early 80s kind of upbringing, even though it was like 10 years later.
Right.
The majority of my cousins on both sides of the family are about your age, or a little older or a little younger.
Right.
And so I feel like because of that, and because of the area in which I grew up, I had that kind of upbringing. And so like all of my cultural touchstones, all of my cultural references are all about that time period. So yeah, if Peter was to turn into Pac-Man to go fight his dad, absolutely, that is my weapon of choice as well.
Yeah.
I'm
No,
all for
I
it.
Yeah, no, and I think that it's interesting because as a person, I was born in 74.
Okay.
So
I
I,
thought you were about 10 years older than me. I thought that was about
yeah.
the time frame. But again, my soul is about that age.
Well, and here's the thing though, and being somebody who grew up in the 70s and 80s,
Mhm.
in the very early 90s before I turned 18,
Mhm.
that it's the bulk of my life was lived during the 80s. The bulk of my childhood was lived in during the 80s.
Mhm.
And so when you grow up in that time, but the pre-internet time, you were kind of beholden to whatever you could get on TV.
Mhm.
Even cable didn't become a major thing until probably the 90s. Um, and people had cable in the 80s, don't get me wrong. There lots of people had cable, but it not everybody did, and it wasn't as wide ranging as it is nowadays.
For sure.
Um, and so you only had whatever you could get, and if you didn't have cable, you only had three stations for the most part. You only had the three broadcast stations, and there wasn't a lot going on. And if you were lucky, you would be able to watch what you wanted to watch. But if you didn't have that many TVs, you only had one TV in the house, you watched whatever your parents watched.
Exactly.
And so you were again beholden to that earlier generation's music, movies, TV shows, whatever they were into. And even then, we grew up, even when I had the ability to watch cartoons and stuff like that, you watched a lot of TV shows and cartoons. I can't tell you how much Leave It to Beaver, Tom and Jerry,
Hmm.
older shows that were from decades past that I watched because that's literally all that was on.
Yeah.
Because they weren't making a lot of shows for kids or even a lot of newer shows. Nowadays, you have so many shows to choose from. There's too many, you know.
Yeah.
I can't even watch half the stuff I want to watch because they're constantly pumping it out. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I
and
mean,
back in the day, you just had whatever was whatever they had in reruns.
right.
So
And so even for me, like as a child of like the mid late 80s, I didn't get my own TV until Christmas of 1991. I remember
yeah,
being a little kid, and once my dad got home from work, what we would watch, because we had cable, but the only TV in the house was in the living room. And
right,
so
right.
what we would watch was at like 7:30, before Nickelodeon switched over to Nick at Night, they played a half hour of Looney Tunes. And so I remember sitting down and watching Looney Tunes with my dad every weekday after supper. And that was what we did.
Right.
With the and then on Saturday mornings I got to watch whatever Saturday morning cartoons were on, and I just watched all of them indiscriminately. I watched Jim and My Little Pony as much as I watched Transformers and GI Joe and
Right. Yeah.
He-Man. So and She-Ra. So I watched all of them because I loved all of them and thought they were wonderful. And so I feel like I have this really weird growing up experience because a lot of the culture I was exposed to was that of maybe the generation previous or the
Right.
decade previous versus um, things of my own generation up until maybe about the mid 90s or so. I think there's like a real like differentiation or cutoff point there or whatever. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating to me. Like I'm watching this movie and watching Guardians 2, and I'm laughing hysterically at all the things that Peter is referencing, and then I'm having to explain what these things are to my husband. My husband is 2 years younger than me, but also like he pretty much only watched PBS or played outside or read
Oh
books
wow.
as a kid. And it wasn't necessarily because, oh, you're not allowed to watch all of that mind-numbing dribble that's effectively a toy commercial for 30
Right.
minutes. It's just because that was just what he wanted to watch. He wanted to watch Mr. Rogers, Sesame Street, and Wishbone. uh and then like he was a Boy Scout, and so he spent a lot of time outside, and he
Right.
loves to read, so he read a lot of books. It's like I do all of those things too, except for scouting. I never did any of that because I don't I mean, I like going outside, that's fine, but
Yeah.
I'm not.
Well, no,
I'm not going to go choose camping if it's
yeah, yeah,
given
exactly.
my own devices. But anyway, I digress a whole bunch. We should like just have like a bonus podcast of us talking about 70s and 80s pop culture stuff, Rob. I think that would be a good time.
Yeah, it would be good.
Yeah,
But
I'd have
yeah,
a good
no,
time with that.
yeah. No, and that just really is telling about who Peter is, because that's all he experienced in terms of pop culture, because once he was taken from Earth, he no longer had that. And so he could only relive in his mind those shows and movies and such. And with Yondu in them, because they were just there wasn't anything like that out in the depths of space. So he just, that's why when you look at him as a character, and of course he's going to be pulling Pac-Man out and all these other references and stuff, and that's what makes it great in a way, especially for kids of the 80s like we are, that it makes that a lot more fun and interesting,
right.
so but yeah, I did think it was funny too, because um just before all of that, he's talking to Ego, and Ego tells him, well, you can make whatever you want, and he's like, oh, I'm gonna make some weird shit. And so it's just like, what exactly were you gonna make, Peter? At least Pac-Man was fairly tame, considering compared to what he possibly could have made.
For sure,
So
for sure.
but yeah, it's I think that it's interesting. And you wanted to talk about the music, especially in that part where he gets that power back. But I want to go into real quick. He has this interaction with Yandu. They reconnect on the ship just before they go deep into the Ego, the planet. And they're reconnecting kind of on the ship, and and Yandu's kind of, because Yandu had been we didn't even talk about this whole Yandu stuff real quick. Going back to the beginning, Yandu is basically has a mutiny on his hands by the laughingly named Taserface.
Taserface.
Yeah. Great actor, playing such an unfortunate role. But he plays it full tilt, which is great.
Who is the actor? Do you know?
I don't know offhand.
Okay.
But
I'm gonna go look that up because it's gonna bug me.
Yeah, he's oh man, let's see.
I'm gonna start humming the Jeopardy theme.
Yeah. Chris Sullivan.
Chris Sullivan. His name is not ringing a bell. Oh, I forgot that Ben Browder was in Guardians too. Oh,
yeah,
he is from my neck of the woods in the Charlotte, North Carolina area.
Oh, interesting.
He was also the lead on Farscape, which I've only seen the pilot of. So sorry.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
No. So he Taserface actually comes from the '90s Guardians of the Galaxy comic.
Right. I remembered that he was in the comic. But
yeah,
it was. I'm just like, man, what a wonderful name.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I think he was played a little bit more seriously in the comic books, but again, you have to remember this was the late '80s, early '90s, and so Taserface, was not cool for sure, but it was a little bit more acceptable than it is now. But yeah, it's so he mutinies, gathers most of the crew on his side, because they feel like Yandu is a little soft on Peter, and not doing what he needs to do to bring more money in for them, being the ravagers that they are. And this is so they mutiny, take him prisoner, and then he has this conversation with Rocket about just about because he kind of calls Rocket out on being a jerk. But and he recognizes what Rocket is doing, and later on this comes into play as well. before they get to Peter and them at Egos, that he confronts Rocket and says, look, I know what you're doing, I know what this is like, and he confronts him about pushing people away,
Right.
because that's what he does. He treats people badly because he doesn't want to get close to them, because he was treated badly, because that's how he was treated, and then he doesn't know how to connect with people, and he's trying to make up for that with um Peter at this point. Um, and so when they have their conversation um, in the ship before the battle with Ego, he tells them that he didn't use his arrow. He wasn't using it with his head. He was using it later on. He says he was using it with his heart,
Mm-hmm.
which helps clue Peter in how to use Ego's power against him.
Right.
And he, uses the feelings he has with his mom and with Yondu and with the Guardians.
Mm-hmm.
This love for all of them, to use it against Ego, because that's really what it's about, is using that love for everybody, using the heart and using your love for people against this guy who has no love for anybody else.
Gotcha.
So.
Yeah. If I may circle back just real quick, Chris Sullivan, who plays the wonderful Taserface, is voice the actor Chris Sullivan. He played or he is in This Is Us, which I have never watched because I've been told every episode will make me cry, and I don't watch things on purpose that will make me cry unless they're Marvel movies. He plays Toby in This Is Us, but I know him best from Stranger Things season 1. He is Benny Hammond.
Yeah, he's the
owner,
guy running the restaurant.
yeah,
Yeah.
he is the owner of the diner. He's the guy that finds Eleven when she
Yep.
first escapes. So thank you for your service to Stranger Things, Chris Sullivan.
Right.
Appreciate you, brother. Anyway, yeah. Proceed. I just wanted to throw that in there as Stranger Things is my favorite TV show, full stop. So
oh yeah, no, it's definitely one of mine as well.
Yeah, for
so.
sure. Gotta put that in there.
Yeah, no, and but I wanted to get back to what you were saying about the music, because this is the point where they use the Fleetwood Mac song.
Right.
So talk about that.
Yeah, so what I really want to do at some point when I get some spare time is, which who knows when that will happen, but I really want to sit down and like pitch a chapter of like a Marvel Academia book all about how music is used in the Guardians of the Galaxy films.
Right.
In particular, Guardians of the Galaxy 2, because I feel like more than any of the other films, and I think Guardians 3 has a lot of really apropos thematic music.
Right.
I think Guardians 2, more than the other two films, really uses music in a thematic way. In particular, if you know anything about music history, so as I mentioned earlier in the episode, when Guardians 2 came out, Mr. Nerdy Blogger and I went to go see the film with two of our best friends that also love Marvel and Marvel movies and things like that.
Right.
I had a completely different experience watching Guardians 2 compared with the other three people in our group, because I, growing up in like middle school, early high school, watched like MTV and VH1 obsessively. And so I knew a whole lot about music history. And so I knew enough about Fleetwood Mac. And this was also because my dad is a big Fleetwood Mac fan. This was about the time in like the mid-late 90s. Fleetwood Mac did a big reunion concert that was filmed and played on TNT.
Okay.
And my dad watched it every time it was on the air. And so I remember learning, because that was always kind of on in the background at our house, like some of the history behind the Rumors album. Rumors is their breakup album. This is the
Right.
album they wrote while they were all like at each other's throats. And The Chain is like kind of one of the big tracks from that album. And it's about that tension that they have. If you don't love me now, you never love me again.
Right.
I can still hear you saying that we would never break the chain. And that scene where the chain is playing and you see a lineup of all of the guardians walking towards the screen, and it's different from how you see the lineup of all the guardians walking towards the audience on screen in the first movie. In the first movie, when you see them all in a line walking towards the audience, like all facing the audience, they're about to go fight Ronan, and it's kind of funny because like Rocket's yawning, somebody's like, I think Drax is scratching his butt or something like
Yeah.
that. It's funny. This time they're all facing the audience, walking in that direction, and they are all visibly like annoyed and grumpy and angry with each other. And they're playing that song, and me as somebody who's super geeky about music trivia and music knowledge, that's why I have a part-time job hosting trivia now. I feel like I'm totally geeking out about this because it's like, oh, this is such a perfect song to play right now. And I remember getting in the car and I'm like totally like I enjoyed the film way more than anybody else did. And so the four of us are in the car and I'm like, but guys, did you not know like they were the way they used that song is so appropriate because of XYZ? And they were like, no, we did not know that information at all. And I'm like, oh man, and so I loved it on that level. And obviously I think Brandy and Fathers and Sons are like the other two
Yeah.
really big thematic numbers. And I kind of hated that they felt like they really needed to over explain Brandy within the film. And I'm like, no,
Right.
like I feel like audiences should be smart enough to understand why Brandy is such an appropriate song for Ego
Right.
and Meredith Quill's relationship. And apparently, no, not everybody has like all this like incessant amount of music trivia crammed in their brain like I do. And so no, and even further to the point, Brandy by Glass Hour was a one-hit wonder. That is
Right.
it. Like they never had another hit after that. And so I'm just like, dang, that's just or Looking Glass. What was the name of that band? I said
Looking
Glass.
Glass. Yeah.
Looking Glass. I'm sorry. Looking Glass. Like Looking Glass never had another hit besides Brandy. And here's the reason why I know that is because Time Life did a whole album of one hit wonders, and I remember watching a commercial. Holy Moses! Like this is why I remember this insane like amount of trivia is because I saw it on a commercial, or I watched some VH1 music special about it. Like
Right.
so anyway, like I thought, man, I wish they hadn't explained that within the movie because I understood what they were getting at.
I
Uh,
think that, like, just
yeah,
from my own point of view, I
yeah.
think that them explaining it was mostly just to explain, because again, it may be a one hit wonder, but I would say it's a fairly obscure song now.
It's,
Um, and
I mean, to be totally fair, again, I grew up with my parents listening to the oldie station on the radio,
right,
and so I'd heard the song a bunch, and so
right.
I mean, so I knew it, but again, I don't know that that was everybody's experience. I just assumed, like, doesn't everybody know Brandy by Lip Gloss?
But also at the same time, I think that, he's explaining what it means in his viewpoint, from his
Mm.
point of view, that, it's not as, because maybe the point of view of the song isn't necessarily the same as what Ego is saying. It might be, especially you're the person who would know more than I do. But for somebody who's like me, I'd never heard the song before.
Oh,
So
really? Okay.
yeah. Not that
Wow.
I'm aware of. I mean, it's quite possible I've heard it, but
Oh,
it
I
it
mean,
it definitely
that's
been quite a while. Maybe in childhood I heard it, but
oh,
uh
okay.
I
No,
don't listen to a lot of oldies.
got you. Okay, sorry.
A lot of older rock. Anyway,
Got you. Okay.
so
Okay. Got you. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look up when that was actually released. That's wild to me. I because I just assume. I mean, again, maybe it's just the area I grew up in. I kind of feel like almost everybody's parents listened to oldies or country.
oh no, my parents did, but it
Yeah.
was just I don't know. That was just a song, 1972.
Look. Wow.
Um,
Okay. 1972.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, it probably I'm like I said, I probably heard it as a kid, but once my music tastes shifted, um, once I gained my own musical tastes and everything like that,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
definitely wasn't the type of music I was into. So
Fair.
I just
Fair.
didn't, you know, and I don't have, whereas I have a good memory for, or a somewhat good memory for obscure comic book knowledge. I just don't have as much in terms of music knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, but yeah, no, so for me that was helpful in kind of understanding his point of view, especially because he's trying to make that connection with Peter, through a song that Peter knew his mother loved. And so um it it kind of and it gives Ego a way to kind of worm his way into Peter a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Because even Mantis says that's what he's trying to do, he's trying to pull Peter in. um
Right. For sure.
and so because who knows how many times Mantis has actually seen this before also,
Right.
she
Yeah.
and how horrifying is that for Mantis,
For sure.
and we find out later on in the holiday special that Mantis is one of Ego's children as well. And so having that, like, how much you see this happening to your other brothers and sisters that he finds around the universe, and on top of that you got to wonder, when is it going to be my turn? When is he going to turn
Exactly.
on me?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's just that's just you know, not a fun prospect. Mantis is an interesting character too. We haven't talked much about her
Oh
yet.
gosh.
But
I really love Mantis so
I
much.
do too. I think Palm
Yeah.
Clemente plays her so well. She's such a good actress in this role.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting. I will admit I'm not huge on knowledge in terms of the character in the comic books.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that she is. Um, I was pretty sure she was human. Let's see.
I have no knowledge of Mantis outside of the Guardians films and the holiday specials. So um
Yeah, so
yeah.
she's a half Vietnamese, half German, um, uh, born on Earth. So she's
Mm.
uh, but she becomes what's called the Celestial Madonna later on, um,
Interesting.
and has to end up mating with a vegetable species called the Kotati.
Is that like the
Um,
broccoli head guy or the carrot guy?
no, that the broccoli one, I can't remember what they're called, but it's definitely not that one.
Okay, gotcha.
Um, yeah. So yeah, she has a weird, complicated history. But yeah,
Gotcha.
so
Okay.
but in the comic book, she's like this uh master martial artist as well.
Mm.
And so there's this whole other history to her, that the obviously the movies just kind of go, we're gonna wipe all that away, we're gonna put our own version in, which is totally fine. Like
Right.
I've said it before that as much as I enjoy what they do bring from the comic books into the movies, that I very much enjoy that they're making their own universe,
Yeah.
that's not having to be a slave to the comic books.
Yeah.
I like
Yeah.
that they get to pick and choose what they use.
Yeah, and you know what? I think that's okay. I think it translates well to film. It doesn't overcomplicate things. It doesn't make the audience feel like for them to watch the movie they have to go read,
Yeah.
the past 25 years or more of comics to understand what's going on. I mean, there are people like you and me that would happily go read the past
Right.
25 years of comics to understand what's going on, but not everybody is as cool as us, Rob. Um, so, um, but yeah, no, I think that is that's really fascinating. But I love what they've done with Mantis in the
Oh yeah.
Guardians. We get this introduction to her in Guardians 2, and almost every time she's on screen, I'm just laughing the
Oh
entire
yeah.
time because she's so sweet and she's so innocent and funny and just says things very bluntly. Um,
Right.
I have been accused of saying of having that kind of personality. Like I can be very sweet, I can be very kind, and then I just say whatever comes into my head. And I don't think I'm saying anything mean or offensive or rude or whatever. I'm just saying what I think, and not everybody's okay with that. um, I don't think I'm quite on like Mantis's level of complete ignorance of, oh, that was
Right.
not appropriate. I should not have said that. Uh, because I don't think that thought ever occurs to her at any point ever.
Right.
Um, but I find that part of her character kind of refreshing, because what that does is that whatever she says is truthful,
Right.
and I really love that about her character. So, and I especially loved watching her play off of Drax, even if he is kind of mean spirited a bit in this one.
Yeah.
I think like we really get some redemption of that in the Guardians holiday special, where
Right.
you see, oh no, Mantis is really like Mantis can hold her own with Drax, and he
Oh
actually
yeah.
likes that. Like because they're both like two like very like that's just how they talk. Like they're
They're
just
both
blunt.
very literal.
They're
Yeah.
both very literal, they're both very blunt, and they just say whatever, and they're not being mean. That's just how they are. um,
Right.
so I think that's a really interesting nuanced relationship that um I mean, we see a lot better in the later Guardians iterations and Guardians appearances, but
Right.
for this first foray, I was so happy whenever she was on screen because she always made me laugh, and Palm is just stinking adorable. My goodness,
Yeah.
she's so cute. I just love her. So I'm more than happy now to go watch her in absolutely anything. I don't care what it is. I like
Well,
I don't care anything about Mission Impossible, but I know she's in the newest one, so I'm all like, I'm gonna have to go watch that one
she's
just for
really
Tom.
good in it too.
I
So
That's what I
yeah.
keep hearing is
And
that,
Haley
oh,
Atwell's in it too. So
oh
that's a
dang,
big plus.
oh no, I have such a girl crush on Haley Atwell. I'm gonna have to go watch it now. Dang it. Okay.
Yeah, she's a major the Palm plays a an antagonist
Okay.
in that one, but Haley Atwell's a major new character
Okay.
for the franchise. So
Wonderful.
uh yeah.
Yeah, keep
So it's
putting
the
all my Marvel action ladies in Mission Impossible movies. That's a guaranteed way to get my money. Just pro tip, whoever makes those movies.
right.
If you want my money, put Marvel actors in them.
No, but I agree. I think that Mantis, the relationship between Mantis and Drax is fun. They creates this nice, funny sibling rivalry
Mm,
kind of relationship with them, where they're kind of like they're obviously the kind of the secondary guardians, that they aren't the main characters. They're part of the group, of course. They're good parts of the group. They're important members of the group, but they also are kind of like, outside the main, you know, trio of maybe Peter, Gamora, and Rocket.
right.
Um, and so it's fun to have them as like the comic relief, the more blunt kind of overtly comic relief,
Hmm.
and somebody to have Drax to play off of, besides the more straight faced
Hmm.
of the group.
Hmm.
So it does make for a fun dynamic as well.
For sure. For
Um,
sure.
but I want to start wrapping this up a bit with the end here, because we get the battle up between Ego and they, like I said before, it takes all of them to kind of defeat him, while Peter's obviously laying on a good portion of the physical aspect of that. We got Groot, who's planting the bomb, that's going to help take him out. and we you come to the end of this, and going back to what I was saying about Yandu telling Peter how to do this, with the heart, not the head. This is that moment where Yandu and Peter kind of connect, to a certain amount, and I think that's what helps Peter in that last moment just before the bomb's about to go off, and he's holding um Ego there, so Ego can't get away, and stop it. That he's and Ego tells him, you'll lose your power, you'll just be normal. And Peter goes, what's so wrong with that?
Mhm.
And this is something that Peter's obviously wants to be bigger than he is. That's why he calls himself Star Lord. He feels like he should be more important. And he has this taste of this, and he loves it, but he's willing to give it all up, to be just a human, and to be part of this family, because he realizes that they are the people who are his family now, not this um this person who may be his blood, but who pretends to be family when they're not.
Right.
And it goes into this overall notion in this movie that's really about the difference between blood family and found family. um and as somebody who myself, I come from a very fractured family. I don't get along with most of my family, and I very rarely talk to anybody outside of my wife and kids. um and so, found family to me is a little bit more important in that way. Outside of my wife and kids, who I love to death. But outside of them, it's friends, it's people who I can connect with, and everything else. They're more important to me, than any of my other family. And so I think that's, what this movie is saying, is that, like, you know, yes, blood family can be good, but this found family, you can, if you don't have that, then you can make a good family with people who will support you and take care of you, and be there for you. And I think that's what this movie gets to the heart of. And um Peter and Yandu have this great moment, when Yandu's saving him, and saying, he may have been your father, but he wasn't your daddy.
Yeah.
And and as much as I screwed things up, and I should have been better, you were still, I should have been a better dad to you, but I wasn't, and I'm sorry for that.
Yeah.
And and it's heartbreaking, because that's when Yandu dies. And it's just this really, really sad moment in the movie, that continues on into his funeral, when the former other groups of the Ravagers, who had cast him out because he had kidnapped Peter for Ego, and they weren't supposed to kidnap children, have anything to do with children, or whatever. And he paid the price for that, but got redemption in the end, both with Peter and with the Ravagers. And
Mhm.
I thought that was a really good way to kind of give him that arc of his, of obviously he cared about Peter. He continued to always um try to take care of him in those little ways, even when Peter didn't realize it.
Right,
And so
right.
I thought that was really cool.
And I think in some ways, like Yandu had to, save face or whatever, and try to pretend like he wasn't showing, for want of better terminology, favoritism towards Peter.
Right.
Um, like, oh, Peter, screwed up a whole bunch of times. Why are you letting him off easy? Why are you not killing him or whatever? And it was because, you know, Yandu loved Peter as his son.
Right.
And so yeah, he's gonna cut him some slack. He's gonna, even when Peter is doing stuff like, taking the Infinity Stone in the first
Yeah.
movie and things like that. So uh I really would, the thing that I love the most about the Guardians films, and I think that's why the Guardians films are my favorite Marvel movies, is because of how they deal with found family.
Right.
Um, I'm fortunate to have fairly good relationships with most of my family and extended family, and yet I also have, and I don't think it has to be one or the other. Like
Right. Yeah.
I have friends in my life that are, I mean, our relationships are as close or closer than that of people I share DNA with.
Right.
And so I love that exploration of that idea in these films. Um, whereas, some people take, yeah, we share DNA, therefore I can do whatever, I can treat you however I like. And
Right.
that doesn't make it okay just because, you're my parent, or you're my sibling, or you're my aunt and uncle, or you're my cousin, or whatever. Um, that doesn't mean that I'm worth less respect than what you would give somebody else, you know?
Right.
Um, so what I love about those films is that anybody can be your family if they're going to be there for you, and if you're going
Right.
to be there for them. So I really love the exploration of that idea, and I think you really get a lot of that in Guardians 2. I mean, I think you get a lot more of that in Guardians 3, but it really amps up that idea in Guardians 2 because it looks at relationships where you share DNA and that relationship is not good. You look at relationships where you come from a family where abuse is present, or a parent is putting you at odds with your sibling when you probably would not have chosen to be at odds with that sibling.
Right.
So there's that kind of dynamic, and it's what it ultimately comes down to is, how am I choosing to be in relationship with that person?
Right. Yeah.
And you can't choose how that person's going to respond to that, but in the case of, like, the thing I think I that is most resonant for me in this film is the relationship with Gamora and Nebula, and
Yeah.
how by the end of the film they've managed to reconcile on some level,
Yeah.
where they're not going to have like an maybe like an outwardly affectionate relationship or whatever, but they've learned that they can live together and that they can be at peace with one another despite what they went through growing up.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And then of course you have Yondu with the line that makes me ugly cry every time I get to it in the film is he may have been your father, but he wasn't your daddy.
Right.
And like like and I mean I'm fortunate to have like a pretty good relationship with my dad, but at the same time there's another like older guy in my life who was I mean a another father figure to me, and in
Right.
some ways I'm like, yeah, Charlie's my daddy too.
Yeah.
And so I felt all I watched this movie and I feel all the feels on a bunch of different levels, and I
Yeah.
think that's why I really connected with Guardians 2 in a lot of ways, whereas other people are
Yeah.
like, it's not as good as the first one. I'm like, no, but I'm having bigger feels in this movie than I did in the first one. The first one is wonderful and it makes me laugh no matter how many times I've seen it. I mean, the film is now 9 years old, and I could put it on right now and I will still laugh out loud at all the same things I've laughed out loud since I saw it for the first time in 2014.
Right.
Uh, but Guardians 2 is the one that, I mean, I still cry in Guardians 1 at we are Groot, but like, Guardians 2 makes me cry on a bunch of different places.
Yeah.
And I think that's good writing. That's
Well,
good storytelling.
and I also think that Guardians 1 was like, it's a great story, but with Guardians 2, James Gunn was given a lot more room
Mm-hmm.
to then explore the characters, because in the first one you get to explore them a little bit, but it's more about them coming together and them just coming together as a group more than anything else, and starting to become that family in a way. But whereas this one is more about the explorations of what family means,
Mm-hmm.
and how sometimes that family can make you mad, and
Right.
but like you can still come back together in the end. And I think that's it's good that Marvel, I think that when Marvel gets a lot of crap put on it about a lot of the um the stories not being good or whatever, everything feeling very samey. And I can understand that to a degree, because sometimes they can at times. But I think that Marvel in general does a pretty good job at trying to explore some of these relationships and stuff through these stories, especially when you can give them the space they deserve in in these later movies. Usually in the first movies, like the first Guardians and stuff like that, they're just trying to introduce you to the characters,
Right.
and trying to give you kind of broad strokes about them. If it does well, then they can go deeper into it in the next movie. And so I think that's kind of what ends up happening is you only get the broad strokes in the first movies,
Right.
and then you've got to wait and let them breathe a little bit more later on, which is
Mhm.
kind of indicative of comic books in general as well. When
Sure.
you're first finding out about these characters and stuff like that, their origin stories and stuff, it may not be as deep as you might get later on when the writers can explore their the depths a little bit more.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, no, I think that does make number two in a lot of ways um not better, but just deeper,
Right. Yeah.
and make it whereas it's maybe not as exciting in certain ways as the first one, that because it brings in more nuance and brings in more of that deep emotional context, that you get it's good, just as good in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely agree with that assessment.
But yeah, so I mean, overall, I really enjoy the movie. I think that having looked at it through this lens this time, having and I noticed it before. Don't get me wrong, but really focusing on it this time just kind of had me appreciating it even more so this time than even the previous times I've watched it.
For sure. For sure. I think like maybe uh one one note I have in my one note I have in my notes that we didn't talk about, and it's completely
Yeah,
silly and completely frivolous, but I want to give a quick shout out to fellow Tennessean Miley Cyrus, who is the voice of Mainframe, which was the robot head
yes,
that we see in this one. She did not come back for Guardians 3. Alas, neither did Michelle Yeoh, but I think Michelle Yeoh's pay grade increased substantially since
yeah,
Guardians
yeah,
2 was released. And I think Miley Cyrus is probably busy or whatever.
yeah,
But even so, I hope at some point maybe we get a Marvel special presentation or whatever of the Ravagers
yeah,
with that iteration, and maybe they can get Miley and Michelle back for that, because I think that would be a lot of fun. I would really
yeah, yeah,
enjoy that for
definitely.
sure, for sure. Um, and special shout out to fellow podcaster Robert Clark, who is a big fan of Howard the Duck. I hope we get
Oh,
Howard the Duck back for that if we get such a thing.
well, was it a
You're Robert.
different?
You're Robert Clark. I'm so
Yeah,
sorry. So sorry. So sorry.
no,
So many, we like you and Robert Turnbull. Robert
right.
Turnbull. Um, are two brilliant Robs with comic book knowledge that show up occasionally on Podcast 616. But Robert Turnbull is a big fan of Howard the Duck. So I
Right,
hope we
right.
get Howard the Duck back for all of that.
No, yeah. I like Howard the Duck. I'm probably not a huge fan, but like I would like to see this version of him pop up somewhere. I think more than anything, he'd be best in a special presentation.
Oh, for sure.
I don't
And
think he deserves a movie or a full on TV series or anything, but a
well,
special presentation could be fun.
oh, it would be a blast because it's Seth Green. Seth Green is
Yeah,
wonderful. He's such a
and he
sweetheart.
has and he does have ties to the Man Thing, so it would work out
Yeah,
really well. So
Yeah, and She-Hulk,
yeah,
like,
and She-Hulk.
please,
Yeah.
let's get them all in the same room. That would be a great time. I would love all of that so much. Also, at Robert Turnbull's recommendation, I did go watch the Howard the Duck movie from the 80s. And it had been on, to be fair, it had been on my list for a little while because
Oh
George
yeah.
Lucas directed it.
Right.
But
Well, he
also,
produced it. He didn't direct it.
oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. He
Yeah.
produced it, but it was a
Yeah.
George Lucas film. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, I've
Yeah.
got to go
Yeah.
watch that. It's Lucas and it's Marvel. Like, come on, that's like it's right in my wheelhouse. And woo, that was interesting. Um, but it was
It's
fun.
definitely
It was
something that's,
fun.
yeah.
And
No,
that, you know what?
it's a
That
weird movie, but it's fun.
you know what? I love me a weird movie from the 80s. I will watch a weird movie from the 80s any day of the week. I ain't mad about it at all. But I love the song, like he's Howard the Duck.
Oh yeah, that's catchy.
Yeah, yeah. And you got Leah Thompson playing the guitar. No, or was she playing guitar? I don't remember. Nobody's
It's been a long time since I've seen it.
nobody's upset about it. It's great. Wonderful. It's a good little popcorn
Definitely.
flick. So make yourself a little drinky drink and go have a good time. So
Definitely.
yeah. Anyway, sorry
All
for
right.
the digression. So,
No, it's all good. Yeah,
mhm.
no, I don't have anything else to say specifically about this movie, so unless you have anything else.
I think maybe the only other thing I just want to give a quick shout to is the use of Fathers and Sons
Okay.
by Cat Stevens. Um, I think that one, it's a really lovely song, but two, uh, again, other people's mileage may vary because as I understand, that song is a little on the overused side. But
Okay.
I had never heard it before Guardians 2, and I thought the way I listen to it now. I don't have kids. I have a niece
Right.
and nephew. But it's this wonderful song about a parent like giving their wisdom to their child. And um, I don't know if I'll ever have kids, but something I would hope that I could relay to my niece and nephew is, I love you and I'm proud of you. And then that's ultimately like what I get out of that song, and the fact that it's being played over the scene where of Yondu's funeral, and Peter like coming to grips with the passing of Yondu, and everybody in the Ravagers honoring Yondu in that way, like
Right.
giving him a full Ravager funeral, even though he was kind of exiled from the Ravagers, I think is really beautiful.
Yeah.
And so I think it's used very well in that moment and in that film. So yeah, that's all
Yeah.
I got to
No,
say
I
about
agree.
that.
All right. Well, why don't you let people know where they can find you online?
Sure. All right, y'all. So if you want to connect with me, there are many ways you can do that. You can hit me up on the tweets. It's not called X, it's still Twitter as far as I'm
Yep.
concerned. But you can hit me up
Always.
on the tweets at the Nerdy Blogger. You can like my Facebook page, facebook.com/the Nerdy Blogger. You can read my words on my blog, nerdyblogging.wordpress.com, where I write about film and television. You can also read my words on fangirlish.com, again, where I'm writing about film and television, mostly Star Trek. Occasionally write a little bit about Marvel, do some film reviews, Stranger Things, horror movies, all that good stuff. All the things that you might enjoy because you're a listener of Creepy and Geeky. You can follow me on Mastodon. I'm at the Nerdy Blogger at mastodon.social. I'm also on Blue Sky, the Nerdy Blogger at Blue Sky dot whatever it is on Blue Sky. I don't know. I'm somewhat new to Blue Sky, but I'm there too. Pretty much all my socials are at the Nerdy Blogger. You can hear me a few different ways. You can hear my words being read on the Sci-Fi 5 podcast, which is 5 minutes of science fiction history 5 days a week. You can also hear me on Podcast 616, which is podcast 616 on the We Made This podcast network, talking all about Marvel with my fantastic Scottish co-host Hugh McStay. So you can have a good accent comparison on there. It's a good time. It's always a good time. We always have wonderful guests on our show, like Robert Clark, of course, for creepy and geeky 4 times, and soon to be more. So you can also hear me if you like all things modern Star Trek. You can hear me on We Are Starfleet, which is also on the We Made This podcast network, specifically talking about Star Trek Strange New Worlds and Star Trek Discovery, with the occasional bonus episode popping up here and there. I also show up on other guest spots on the We Made This podcast network, so you can check out all the shows there on wemadethispodcast.com. I think that's all the places you can find me. I'm going to stop talking now because apparently I keep, I got a lot going on. So
sounds like it. Wow.
Yeah. I'm busy. I'm a busy lady.
Yeah. All right. Well, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come visit me and talk some Guardians of the Galaxy.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to talk about Guardians anytime.
Good. All right.
Thanks again to Ashley for joining me. On Monday, it's part 3 of my Saw series, and Kat Velour returns to the show to talk about Saw 5 and 6. And on Friday, Alice Boyd Leslie joins me to talk about Spider-Man Homecoming. Thanks for listening. Creepy and Geeky is a part of the Morbidly Beautiful podcast network. Please check out morbidlybeautiful.com/podcasts for more great shows. If you like what you've heard, please consider giving the show 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, please share the podcast on social media to help spread the word. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or at creepyandgeeky.com. Music for the podcast is Gratitude, composed by Jerry Smith. You can follow the podcast on social media at Creepy and Geeky on both Twitter and Instagram. If you'd like to follow me, I'm Geek Thulu on Twitter and Blue Sky, and geek.thulu on Instagram. You can support the podcast by ordering teas and more on TeePublic or by donating to the coffee page. All of the links are in the show notes. Finally, don't forget, stay creepy.